He thought he had left the war behind, but fate had another mission waiting deep in the quiet woods of West Virginia. One morning, his dog Max pulled him off the trail toward something hidden under the vines. It was no ordinary wreck, it was an abandoned military helicopter. And inside lay a secret powerful enough to change everything. What truth could be buried so deep that men would kill to protect it? And what could a single veteran and his loyal dog do against the darkness it would unleash? Stay with us to discover their journey of courage, faith, and redemption through loss and loyalty. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The air was still that morning, the kind of quiet warmth that came in late summer when the hills of West Virginia stood dry and golden dust lifted gently from the roadside as a pickup passed through Cedar Hollow, a sleepy mountain town built from stone timber and long memories. The sky stretched high and pale with no hint of rain, and the smell of pine resin clung to the wind. Ryan Brooks stood outside his small workshop on the edge of town, the sleeves of his worn flannel shirt rolled to his elbows. At 35, he was broad-shouldered but lean, a man built by work and war. His hair was dark brown and cropped close, his skin weathered by years of sun and sweat, and a faint scar curved beneath his jawline. His eyes, gray with a trace of green, held a steady focus, but sometimes when he thought no one was watching, they drifted far away. The morning light slid across the hood of the old Chevy he had been fixing. He wiped his hands on a rag and listened to the familiar hum of tools inside the open bay. It was a rhythm. He had built his life around a quiet repetition that made sense, unlike the noise that used to live inside his head. The war had ended years ago, but echoes of it still followed him home in small ways. In the sudden startle at a dropped wrench, in the way he preferred silence to conversation. At his feet lay Max, his German shepherd, now 4 years old and full grown. The dog's coat gleamed in shades of gold and black beneath the sunlight. His build was powerful but graceful, his ears always alert, and his eyes, a deep amber, seemed to hold an understanding that went beyond words. Ryan had rescued him as a pup, but in truth, it was Max who had done the rescuing. The dog had a gift for sensing Ryan's moods, pressing close when the darkness crept too near, grounding him without judgment. After lunch, Ryan closed the shop. He locked the heavy door, slung his old rifle over one shoulder, and whistled once. Max rose, immediately tail, swishing with controlled excitement. Hunting had become less about meat and more about peace. The forest offered something the town never could: the sound of breathing trees and the feeling of being small in a world that kept moving. They followed the dirt trail that led into the low hills behind the town. The path wound between clusters of oaks and tall grass, browned by the dry season. Cicadas buzzed overhead in a steady drone, and each step sent a faint crunch through the dust. Ryan moved with the measured gait of someone who had spent too much time marching under orders. Every movement was deliberate, every glance around him cautious. He didn't talk much anymore, not even to Max. The war had taken the habit of easy speech, yet when the dog looked up at him, eyes bright with trust, Ryan felt something soften. He bent to pat Max's head, fingers brushing through the thick fur at his neck. "Good boy. Let's stretch our legs a bit." The dog's tail thumped once before he trotted ahead, nose to the wind. The air smelled of dry pine and warm earth. The forest was quiet, except for the gentle rhythm of their steps and the rustle of a squirrel somewhere unseen. Ryan paused once to take a sip from his canteen. His thoughts drifted as they often did to the desert, the burning air, the hum of helicopters, the faces of men who didn't come home. He shook the memory off like dust. He told himself this was his new mission now, to keep going, to keep steady, to make each day work, like a gear that turned cleanly. Max barked once short, and low break in his thoughts. The dog had stopped ahead on the path, body stiff, ears pointed. Ryan frowned and walked toward him, scanning the woods. There was no sound of danger, only the dry whisper of wind through leaves. "What is it, boy?" he said quietly. Max looked back, eyes intent, then stepped off the narrow trail. His movements were sure, driven by some scent Ryan couldn't detect. Ryan sighed under his breath, but followed. It wasn't the first time Max had wandered after a rabbit or a half-buried scent. They moved through the underbrush, pushing aside low branches. The light dimmed under the trees, soft gold turning to green shadow. The dog stopped again, head tilted, tail rigid. His paws scraped at the dirt for a moment before he turned to face Ryan waiting. Ryan stepped beside him and glanced around. There was nothing but the forest, the dry soil, and the sound of a distant woodpecker tapping against bark. He felt a faint unease crawl beneath his ribs. The dog rarely acted without reason. "All right, buddy," he said finally. "Whatever it is, we'll take a look tomorrow." But Max didn't move. His body stayed taut. His gaze locked on something unseen farther ahead. Ryan felt a strange weight in the air, a tension without a source. He knelt and placed a steady hand on the dog's back, feeling the faint tremor of restrained energy beneath the thick fur. "We're good, Max. Let's head back." The dog looked at him once more, then slowly relaxed, though his tail still flicked with alertness. They turned toward the fading light, walking back through the woods as the cicadas quieted and the hills began to glow amber. As they neared the clearing, Ryan glanced back over his shoulder. The trees behind them swayed gently in the evening breeze, ordinary and unthreatening. Yet something about the way Max had frozen stayed in his mind. He didn't know it then, but that single moment, the bark, the hesitation, the way the dog had looked into the trees would be the first small crack in the quiet life he had built. That night, as Ryan sat on the porch beside Max, watching the last orange strip of daylight fade, he felt a stirring he couldn't name. The wind rustled the tall grass around the cabin, soft and restless. And though he didn't yet understand why Ryan Brooks could sense that the stillness of Cedar Hollow was only the calm before something deeper began to move, the morning sun came slow and warm over the ridges, spilling pale gold through the thinning trees. The dry season had settled deep into the woods, and the forest floor was crisp underfoot, coated with leaves that cracked faintly with every step. The air smelled of resin and old bark. Nothing moved except the soft ripple of wind that passed through the oaks like a long-held sigh. Ryan Brooks walked with his rifle slung loosely on his shoulder, his steps measured steady. His shirt clung to his back, where sweat gathered beneath the sun. Beside him, Max moved in silence, tail, low nose, skimming the air muscles tense beneath his golden and black fur. The forest that morning felt different to Ryan, heavier, somehow, as though it carried a story waiting to be uncovered. He had spent years trying to quiet the part of himself that searched for trouble, but old habits die slow. The Marine in him was never gone, only buried beneath the rhythm of small-town life. That instinct, the one that had kept him alive through sandstorms and ambushes, now stirred again as Max moved ahead, weaving between low branches with restless urgency. Ryan called out softly, his voice low and calm, "Easy, boy." But Max did not slow. The dog pushed through a cluster of dry ferns, barked once, a sharp sound that cut through the silence and vanished down a narrow slope. Ryan sighed, half exasperation, half concern. He followed Boots sliding on loose soil. The slope was steeper than it looked, a funnel of broken earth and tangled roots that led into a shallow ravine. He caught himself against a tree and scanned the dense green below. The forest was thick there, the light fractured into shards through layers of vines. Max barked again, a deep, urgent tone that carried weight. Ryan pushed on, brushing aside branches that scratched across his forearms. His heart thudded in his chest, not from fear, but from the strange pull of curiosity that tightened with each step. When he reached the bottom, the air changed. It was cooler, stiller. The sounds of the forest faded muffled by the walls of the ravine. Max stood ahead, paws planted tail straight, staring at a wall of tangled vines. His fur was bristled slightly along his spine, his ears pricked forward, every line of his body taut with focus. Ryan stopped beside him, catching his breath. "What have you got there, boy?" He muttered quietly, his tone half wary, half reverent. He knelt and brushed at the vines. Underneath the coarse green tangle, something cold met his fingertips. Not rock metal. He pulled back a handful of vines and froze. A flat surface appeared beneath the dirt, and leaves dull and scarred the color of olive drab. The edge of a door frame curved into view, then a broken rotor blade half buried in earth. Ryan stood heart-pounding slow and deep. It was the wreckage of a helicopter. For a moment, the world narrowed to the shape of that broken machine. The forest around him fell away. It wasn't just wreckage, it was memory made solid. He had flown in machines. Like that, felt the rattle of their rotors through. His bones smelled the hot metal and jet fuel. Now this one lay silent and still, its shell reclaimed by time and moss. He stepped closer, running a hand along the corroded fuselage. The letters on its side were nearly gone, eaten away by weather and years. But the outline of its frame told him enough. Military-issue combat model. The kind that belonged to a world he had tried to leave behind. Max circled the wreck, nose to the ground, sniffing at the earth where grass refused to grow. Ryan followed, slowly tracing the damage. The tail section was torn clean away, the cockpit crushed at an angle where it had hit the ravine wall. Whatever had brought it down had happened hard and fast. He felt something tighten in his chest, a quiet ache that had no words. He thought of the pilot, whoever he had been. A soldier like himself, maybe. Someone who had known the same smell of oil and dust, the same fear of silence after impact. Ryan found the cockpit half buried in debris and leaned forward. The glass canopy was shattered edges rimmed with rust. He hesitated before reaching in, brushing away leaves and dirt. There still strapped in the pilot seat were the remains of a man. The flight suit had long since faded to gray and brown, torn in several places, but the patches were still faintly visible, the faded emblem of the U.S. Army Air Corps. Ryan's throat tightened. He pulled his cap from his head and bowed it slightly, an old reflex born of respect. He stayed that way for a while, hand resting against the cold metal frame. In his mind, he saw flashes of memory, men he had known, faces that still visited his dreams, the sound of radio chatter right before everything went quiet. He had buried enough friends to know the weight of it. When he finally straightened, the air felt heavy around him. Max had settled near the cockpit, lying down, but watchful, his eyes following every move. Ryan crouched again, studying the inside of the cockpit. The controls were twisted and blackened wires hanging like vines. Among the wreckage, one thing caught his eye, a small compartment under the co-pilot's seat. its latch barely visible under a crust of rust and moss. He scraped away the grime with the edge of his knife and pulled. The latch gave with a metallic groan. Inside, wrapped in a fragment of canvas, was a small rectangular case, metal military issue. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the cold weight of it. A serial number was engraved faintly along the side. The lock was intact. He didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, he looked back toward the pilot's remains. The man's skeletal fingers still gripped the edge of the console, frozen in a last act of control. Ryan spoke quietly, almost to himself. "You went down fighting, didn't you?" Max whined softly, the sound low and steady. Ryan set the case on the ground beside him and took a deep breath. He felt the conflict inside him rise like a tide, duty against fear, reverence against curiosity. The Marine in him told him to report it, to treat it like evidence. The man in him, the one who lived alone in the woods, felt the pull of something more personal. He reached out and carefully removed the faded patch from the pilot's sleeve, folding it once before slipping it into his pocket. It wasn't theft. It was remembrance. The wind shifted through the ravine, carrying the smell of rust and old earth. Ryan stood there for a long time, the case heavy in his hands. The weight of it was more than metal. It was the weight of questions he wasn't ready to ask. He finally slung the rifle back over his shoulder and whistled softly. Max rose, stretching his legs, ears flicking toward the fading light. "Let's go home, boy." As they climbed the slope, Ryan paused once, turning back toward the wreck. The setting sun cast long shadows across the twisted frame, painting the metal with streaks of gold and fire. It looked almost alive in the dying light, a sleeping beast wrapped in vines. When they reached the edge of the forest, Ryan glanced down at the case again. He felt the cold of it through the fabric of his pack. It hummed in his thoughts, the way old instincts do when they sense the beginning of trouble. That night, as he sat on the porch of his cabin, the world around him seemed the same as always. The wind through the trees, the distant call of crickets, the dog lying at his feet. Yet the silence was different now. It carried something new, a faint vibration in the air, like a wire pulled too tight. He set the case on the table beside his lamp, but did not touch it again. Some secrets he knew could not stay buried forever. But for one last night, he let himself believe in peace. He reached down and rubbed Max's neck, feeling the warmth of the living creature that had led him to the grave of another good work. "Today," he murmured, "we'll figure it out tomorrow." The dog's tail gave a slow, soft tap against the floor. Outside, the forest exhaled in the darkness, old and waiting. The morning was gray and quiet, the kind of stillness that came after days without rain. The trees around Cedar Hollow seemed frozen in place, the dry air heavy with dust and the faint scent of pine. Ryan Brooks sat on the porch of his cabin, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the small metal case that lay on the table beside him. The same case he had found deep in the ravine, the one that refused to leave his thoughts. He had slept little. The image of the wrecked helicopter lingered behind his eyes every time he closed them. The faded patch from the pilot's sleeve folded neatly in his pocket, a silent promise to a stranger. Max lay at his feet, the German shepherd's head resting on his paws, his ears flicking every few seconds at unseen sounds. His coat caught the morning light, glinting gold and black, and his amber eyes followed Ryan's every move, as though he too was waiting for something. Ryan sighed, rubbed his temples, and reached for the case. The metal was cold, even in the warmth of the morning sun. He had handled enough military equipment in his life to recognize what it was: an encrypted data drive, the kind used for field intelligence or mission records. It had no obvious opening, no cable port, just a narrow slot and a faint serial number etched on its side. Underneath that number were small letters, almost invisible beneath the grime: ZKR 07012019. He did not know yet that those marks would become a key. Inside the cabin, light filtered through the single window painting, soft lines across the worn wooden floor. The space was simple, practical: a small stove, a workbench, a narrow bed, and a desk littered with old tools. Ryan placed the case on the desk and sat down. Max followed, lying close enough that his flank brushed Ryan's boot. Ryan powered on his laptop, an old durable model built for field work. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale glow over the room. When he connected the case through a custom cable, the drive appeared immediately, but demanded a password. A gray box filled the screen, military-grade encryption. No hint of what lay behind it. Ryan leaned back in his chair, thinking he had no access codes, no clearance, no reason to open what might be government property. Yet something in him refused to walk away. Maybe it was duty. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the same restlessness that had followed him since the war. Whatever it was, he could not leave it alone. He spent an hour trying basic entry commands, old procedures he had learned during his service. Nothing worked. The system was layered too deep. The drive's defenses were not designed for an average field soldier. They were the kind of security meant to keep even officers out. The more he tried, the more the machine seemed to push back, mocking him with its blinking cursor. Max rose, stretched and padded to the corner, sniffing at Ryan's jacket, which still hung over a chair. The dog began to nose through one of the pockets, tail wagging faintly. Ryan turned, frowning. "What is it, boy?" The dog looked back at him, then nudged something free from the fabric. A small piece of metal clinked onto the floor. It was the tag he had taken from the pilot's sleeve, the one engraved with strange letters and numbers. Ryan bent down, picked it up, and turned it over in his hand. The letters were worn, but still readable: ZKR. He felt a spark of realization. It was the same pattern as the engraving on the case itself. The connection tightened something inside him. He unbuttoned his jacket and pulled out the folded patch again. It had a torn seam along the collar. He noticed for the first time a small bulge under the lining. He took a knife and carefully cut through the threads. Inside was a strip of material stiff, like polymer, printed with faint numerals: 07012019, July 1st, 2019. He stared at the two pieces, the tag and the strip. The weight of the moment pressed against him. Max sat nearby, head tilted, ears perked as if waiting for the next move. Ryan reached for the keyboard, typed the sequence slowly: ZKR 07012019, then pressed enter. The screen flickered once. The gray box vanished. A new directory appeared, filled with a neat list of files labeled with cold precision: manifests, comms, logistics, intel. The air in the room seemed to shift. Ryan's pulse quickened. He clicked the first folder: manifests. Lines of text filled the screen. Itemized lists of shipments, coordinates, serial numbers. It was standard logistics language, until his eyes caught on one detail. The contents were not outdated. Surplus materials. They were state-of-the-art. Missile guidance units, advanced sniper optics, encrypted communications rigs, all listed as transferred to a base in Germany. But the routing codes were wrong. subtly wrong. The system had been falsified. Ryan scrolled further. Each file bore signatures and approval stamps, all official, all convincing to anyone who did not look closely. But Ryan had seen enough supply chains to know a cover when he saw one. Someone was moving high-grade weapons through legitimate channels under false orders. He leaned back, heart heavy. He had seen corruption before on small scales. A few crates gone missing, a truck rerouted. But this was something larger, colder, deliberate. The kind of operation that needed connections at the very top. He opened the folder, labeled comms. Inside were several encrypted voice logs and one small text file labeled access key. He opened the text file first. It contained a short line of code that unlocked the recordings. One by one, the files began to play. A woman's voice filled the small cabin, smooth, calm, and clipped with authority. The kind of voice used to giving orders, not taking them. She spoke in measured phrases about deliveries, windows of opportunity, and plausible deniability. Her tone carried no emotion, only precision. In another clip, she discussed prices with a man whose accent was faintly European. Her words were surgical, stripped of anything human. Ryan listened, his stomach tightening. That voice was familiar in the way that all powerful voices are. It belonged to someone used to command someone insulated from consequence. A name surfaced through one of the data tags attached to the recordings. Isabella Reed, CEO, Aegis Tactical Solutions. Ryan knew the company. Everyone in the service had. They were one of the largest private security contractors in the country, providing everything from convoy escorts to weapons testing. It was supposed to be a name tied to patriotism, discipline, and profit. Now it was tied to something else entirely. He paused. The playback. Leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The old instincts were awake now, alert, calculating. He had no proof beyond the data on his screen. No way to explain where he had found it. No one he could safely tell. But the truth of it was undeniable. The evidence was real, and whoever this woman was, she had power. Max whined softly, pressing his head against Ryan's leg. The touch pulled him back to the present. Ryan scratched the dog's ear absent-mindedly, then looked back at the screen. The folder, named Intel, blinked as if waiting. He opened it. The contents were brief, a summary file, and a note at the bottom marked Secure Chain, Access Level, Black. He tried to open it, but another password wall appeared, one he could not breach. The system refused any further entry. Ryan shut the laptop. The room fell silent again, the hum of electronics fading into the dry air. He leaned back in the chair, eyes on the ceiling. A low unease grew in him, heavier than fear. A sense that he had stepped onto ground that did not belong to him. He thought of the pilot of the wreckage of the Silence in those woods. This man had died for something. The drive, the patch, the tag, it all connected to that death. What he held now was not just information. It was the reason someone had wanted it buried. Outside, the day was fading, the light slanting gold across the porch. He closed the laptop, slid it back into the drawer, and exhaled. Max looked up his tail, thumping lightly against the floor, as if asking if it was over. Ryan stood, walked to the window, and stared toward the forest. The trees stood still and endless, hiding their secrets, the way soldiers hid their wounds. He rested his hand on the back of the chair, fingers tapping softly against the wood. His mind was already moving in quiet, relentless circles. The Marine in him wanted to act. The man who had lost too much wanted to leave it alone. He looked down at Max and spoke softly. "Guess we are not done with this yet, are we?" The dog tilted his head, then rested it back on his paws. Calm and certain, as always, Ryan turned off the lamp. The forest beyond the window had already darkened into shadow. Somewhere out there, the wreck lay silent. The secrets inside the drive whispered in his head. The stillness around him felt different now, heavy with the echo of something waiting to return. The night fell over Cedar Hollow like a slow curtain drawn across the sky. The last glow of sunset faded behind the ridges, leaving the forest draped in shadow. The air was still heavy with the smell of pine and dry soil. Ryan Brooks sat inside his cabin, the soft yellow light of a single lamp casting long shapes across the floor. His laptop rested open on the table, the encrypted drive still connected. The hum of the fan filled the silence steady and mechanical. Ryan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the screen that now showed nothing but the word disconnected. His pulse had not slowed since the moment the files stopped loading. Something had happened. The drive had sent a signal before he noticed. The thought pressed against him, cold and sharp like a blade in the dark. He had triggered something, and now, whatever secret was hidden in that machine knew where he was. Max lay near the doorway, his golden black fur blending into the dim light. The dog's ears flicked at every sound outside. Ryan could sense it too. The quiet that did not feel like peace, but like waiting. He rose, moved to the window, and peered into the night. The forest was dark, silent, the stars half hidden by a thin haze. His reflection looked back at him in the glass, a tired face, lean and drawn. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes deepened by the glow of the screen. He turned back to the table, pulled the cable from the drive, and closed the laptop. He packed both into an old rucksack, his hands steady, though his chest burned with unease. Every instinct, honed in war, told him the same thing. You are not alone anymore. A faint whine came from Max low in his throat. Ryan froze, listening. There it was, distant at first, the muted hum of an engine, then the crunch of tires on gravel outside the gate. No one came up here at night, not unless they had a reason. He crossed the cabin in 3 strides, doused the lamp, and stood in the dark, letting his eyes adjust. The sound grew clearer. Headlights cut briefly across the trees, then went dark. He moved to the door, lifted his rifle from its hook, and checked the chamber. The metal felt cold against his palm. Max stood alert beside him, the dog's eyes catching the faintest glint of starlight. Outside, the night thickened. Every sense in Ryan's body sharpened into focus. He could smell the faint trace of exhaust and something else, something acrid like burnt oil. Whoever was out there had killed engines, but not power. They were professionals, not locals. Then it came, the distant whir of a drone, faint but unmistakable. A small reconnaissance model. Ryan had heard that sound in another life. The eye in the sky, the pulse of fear, mixed with the clarity of training. He crouched low, moving toward the back of the cabin where the trees grew thick. He opened the small side window and motioned for Max. The dog slipped through. Soundlessly, Ryan took one last look at the cabin, his home, his small piece of peace. Then a sudden flash lit the front yard, white and violent, followed by the shatter of glass. The first shot punched through the window, spraying wood across the floor. He ducked, rolling to the wall, his heart hammering. They were not amateurs. He counted at least 3 muzzle flashes outside. One of the front tires of his truck exploded under fire. Another round hit the door frame, sending splinters across his cheek. Max barked once, a deep, commanding sound that cut through the gunfire. The noise seemed to confuse them for a moment, breaking their rhythm. Ryan crawled toward the back door, grabbed his pack, and slung it over his shoulder. The weight of the drive inside felt like a live thing pulsing with danger. Max moved in tight beside him, ears pinned, eyes wide. They had no time. He kicked open the back, latch slipped into the dark. The night swallowed them instantly. Ryan stayed low, moving toward the tree line. The gunfire at the front stopped, replaced by the sound of boots crunching over gravel. The mercenaries were spreading out surrounding the cabin. Ryan whispered, barely audible, "Stay close." Boy Max moved with him, perfectly silent, his body a shadow against the ground. The forest ahead was dense, dry leaves, muffling their steps. They reached the first row of trees just as the cabin door crashed open behind them. Light flooded the clearing, the white beam of tactical flashlights cutting through the dark. Ryan looked back, once saw silhouettes moving inside the cabin, figures dressed in black body armor, helmets, communication rigs on their shoulders. He recognized the posture, the efficiency. They were soldiers, but not official Aegis contractors, maybe hired to clean up loose ends. The drone buzzed again overhead, its red light sweeping across the treetops. Ryan dropped flat, pulling Max down beside him. The light passed inches above them before moving on deeper into the woods. He could hear the mercenaries talking, short-clipped commands, voices filtered through radio masks. Their tone was calm, too calm. They thought this was simple. Ryan's mind worked fast. The creek lay half a mile north. If they could reach it, the water might mask their heat signature long enough to lose the drone. He touched Max's flank, signaled forward. The dog crept ahead, muscles rippling in silence. Ryan followed, staying low, stepping only where Max had stepped. Behind them, the first explosion ripped through the cabin. A deep, muffled roar shook the trees, embers shot skyward, turning into drifting sparks. The firelight licked the trunks in flashes of orange and gold. Ryan kept moving, fighting the pull to look back. He felt something twist inside him as the home he built burned away, taking with it every quiet night, every morning spent in peace. But survival came first. The forest thickened branches clawing at his sleeves. The air was hot from the blast. But the deeper he went, the cooler it became. Max stopped once, ears pricked toward the sound of movement on their left. Ryan froze, held his breath. He could hear them now, two men moving parallel, whispering through comms, searching in patterns. Their boots cracked twigs, not far away. He could almost feel the vibration of their steps through the ground. He knelt, pressed a hand to Max's neck. The dog waited, calm, breathing slow. Ryan picked up a stone and threw it across the brush to the right. The sound landed sharp. The men turned instantly, flashlights swinging toward it, firing short bursts of suppressed gunfire. The distraction gave them 10 seconds. Ryan moved the opposite way, dragging Max through a narrow ditch, then into a small ravine, thick with shadows. They stayed there until the voices faded, replaced only by the whisper of wind and the hum of the drone far off. Ryan finally exhaled, his pulse still hammering. Max pressed close, his warm breath against Ryan's arm. When they reached the creek, Ryan knelt, scooped a handful of water over his face. The cold bit into his skin, grounding him. He looked at Max, who stood ankle-deep in the current, fur slicked by the moonlight. "We made it for now." Ryan whispered more to himself than to the dog. Max wagged his tail, once his eyes bright and steady, always waiting for the next command. Ryan sat back, listening to the distant echo of the forest. Behind them, the horizon glowed faint orange from the fire that had once been his cabin. He felt the loss, like a bruise deep under the ribs, but he forced himself to focus. Survival first, answers later. He glanced down at the pack beside him, the small metal drive still inside, still humming in his thoughts. Somewhere in that machine lay the reason for tonight. The forest around him breathed quietly, full of shadows and unseen watchers. Ryan tightened his grip on Max's collar. "Come on, boy," he said softly. "Time to move again." They disappeared into the dark, the sound of their steps swallowed by the night, and the low rhythm of the creek running through the trees. The morning mist hung low above the forest floor, like a silver veil. The air was cool and still, except for the distant murmur of running water. Ryan Brooks moved carefully through the dense undergrowth, his boots silent against the damp soil. Max padded ahead of him, tail low, ears alert. The dog's nose traced invisible paths through the air, leading them deeper toward the sound of the stream. Ryan had not slept in almost 30 hours. His mind burned with exhaustion, but his instincts stayed sharp. He and Max had followed the creek for miles, moving north through terrain that grew wilder with every step. The sound of pursuit had faded some time before dawn, but he knew they were not safe. He trusted the forest more than the men chasing him, but even the wilderness had its eyes. As the sun rose, thin beams of gold filtered through the pines and touched the glistening rocks near the water. Ryan crouched at the edge of the creek and splashed his face. The cold helped steady him. He reached into his rucksack and pulled out the laptop, hoping for answers. The battery light blinked weakly red. He powered it on and opened the encrypted logs, one last time scrolling through the lines of code until a fragment caught his eye. Buried among system files was a single corrupted log titled Navlog Partial. The text looked broken, unreadable, but deep within the mess of characters, one line remained clear, a string of numbers and letters mixed together, followed by faint symbols. It was a coordinate line. Ryan stared at it for a long moment, his mind grinding through fatigue and logic. He pulled a small notepad from his pocket and wrote the numbers down. Max watched him from nearby, panting lightly. The man exhaled slowly, reading the coordinates again. They pointed toward a narrow valley west of the main ridge, a place locals called Whisper Canyon. He remembered it faintly from his hunting trips years ago, a remote area filled with steep cliffs and a waterfall that cut through a hollow in the rocks. Few people went there because the trails had long disappeared. Ryan closed the laptop, slipped it back into the pack, and rose to his feet. He glanced at Max, whose fur shimmered in the sunlight. "Come on, boy. One more mile." By noon, they reached the ridge overlooking the canyon. The wind rose, carrying the scent of moss and whetstone. Ryan stood at the edge, scanning the view below. A thin waterfall spilled down from a dark crack in the cliff face, its spray forming a faint rainbow in the air. Around it, dense ferns and ivy climbed the rocks. Their green shimmer seemed untouched by time. Ryan felt a pull in his chest, something between dread and purpose. He started down the slope, every step deliberate. The rocks were slick, and the soil soft from years of hidden streams. Max moved beside him, agile and careful, his tail brushing Ryan's leg for balance. When they reached the base, Ryan stopped to catch his breath. The roar of the waterfall filled the air, drowning all other sound. Behind the cascade, a shadow hinted at an opening barely visible. Beneath a curtain of ferns and moss, Ryan approached, brushing the leaves aside. A narrow gap yawned before him, dark and cold. The smell of wet earth drifted out. Max sniffed the air and wagged his tail. Once Ryan crouched low and slid inside his boots, sinking into the damp floor. The cave was shallow, but wide enough to stand. The light filtering through the veil of water cast trembling shapes on the walls. In the center, half buried in mud, was a black case shaped like a small trunk. The latches were rusted, but intact. Ryan knelt, wiped the grime away, and recognized the military grade, seal water and dust-proof. He unlatched the case slowly. It opened with a soft hiss. Inside, everything was neatly arranged in layers. There were folders sealed in plastic, labeled with military codes and dates. A small stack of papers folded with precision lay beside a weatherproof memory card marked video evidence. Beneath it was a map, laminated and detailed, showing the canyon and a network of tunnels stretching farther north. And tucked beneath the map was a single envelope sealed and addressed by hand. Ryan hesitated before opening it. The handwriting was strong, deliberate. Captain Thomas Weber. He unfolded the paper carefully, reading the words in the dim light. If you are reading this, I am already gone. They found out what I was doing. The crash was not an accident. I hid what I could hear. The truth cannot die with me. Trust no agency, no command. Their reach is deeper than you know. The only person who might still help is a journalist named Ben Carter. He knows how to reach me, or at least he used to. I left a satellite phone in an abandoned mine north of this canyon called Widow's Maw. Use it. Tell him the evidence lives, and that Weber kept his promise. The signature at the bottom was faint but steady. Ryan read the note twice, then folded it again, placing it gently back inside the envelope. The air in the cave seemed heavier now, thick with the weight of final words. Max nudged his hand softly, breaking his stillness. The dog's eyes were bright steady, reminding him of the world outside. Ryan packed everything with care, sealing the case again and securing it in his rucksack. He stood at the entrance of the cave, looking through the veil of falling water. The sunlight flickered through it in shards, and for a brief moment he felt peace. A soldier's promise had crossed years and death to reach him. He stepped back into the open air, letting the mist cool his face. He turned to Max, his voice quiet but firm. "We have a new direction, boy." The dog barked once short and clear as if in answer. Ryan smiled faintly, exhaustion softening his expression. But peace never stayed long. The ground outside bore marks fresh ones. A trail of boot prints pressed deep into the dry soil near the rocks, leading straight toward the cave. The size and pattern were uniform military issue. The men who had burned his cabin were close. Ryan's breath slowed his focus, sharpening. The world around him seemed to contract to the rhythm of his pulse. He crouched beside the prints, tracing the edge of one with his finger. They were recent, maybe an hour old. He looked up, scanning the forest line, the whispering leaves hiding too many places for eyes to watch from. He reached for Mac's collar, the gesture automatic. Stay close. The dog pressed near, muscles tensed. Ryan's thoughts raced. There was no time to linger. The note, the coordinates, the drive, everything pointed forward, not back. The widows. Ma waited, and the enemy was already in motion. The wind shifted, carrying a faint metallic echo, like the rattle of gear in motion. Ryan tightened the straps on his rucksack and started toward the north edge of the canyon. His boots sank softly into the moss. Max trotted beside him, silent, except for the steady rhythm of his breathing. The waterfall roared behind them, washing away their tracks as they vanished into the shadow of the trees. The forest night was dense and breathless, the air cold enough to sting the lungs. The moon hid behind a veil of drifting clouds, leaving only faint streaks of silver across the ground. Ryan Brooks moved in silence, every motion deliberate, his breath controlled and shallow. His left shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed him hours earlier, but the pain was a reminder that he was still alive. Max moved just ahead, nose low tail, still the German shepherd's dark coat blending into the colorless shadows. The trail had grown narrow, the soil packed with old stone and broken branches. It led toward the mouth of a forgotten mine carved into the base of the mountain. The entrance gaped wide like the hollow of a dead beast, framed by decaying wooden beams and rusted rails that disappeared into the dark. Ryan paused, crouching beside a rotted sign, half buried in dirt. The faded words, "Widow, Maw Mine." He felt the echo of Weber's letter in his mind, the last coordinates, the promise of the satellite phone. He ran a hand over his face, wiping away the grime, sweat mixed with dust and blood from his shoulder. He knew the mine could be a trap, but he had no choice. The mercenaries were behind him, and the answers lay ahead. He glanced at Max, whose eyes caught the moonlight, reflecting a steady, amber glow. "You ready, boy?" Max tilted his head once, then padded forward into the tunnel. Inside, the air changed immediately damp and heavy with the smell of iron and age. Dust floated in the thin beam of Ryan's flashlight like drifting ghosts. The sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere deep within. The tunnel walls were lined with old timbers, their surfaces splintered and gray. The weight of years pressing down Ryan's boots stirred small clouds of dirt that rose and hung before settling again. Max moved slowly, his paws soundless against the uneven ground. The dog's ears twitched at every shift of air, his body low, his movements precise. Ryan followed, trusting the animal more than his own eyes. He kept the flashlight aimed low, avoiding the beam from stretching too far ahead. Light was both safety and danger inside places like this. The tunnel branched twice, the first leading into a collapse shaft, the second sloping downward toward the deeper levels. The air grew colder. Ryan could hear his own heartbeat thudding against his ribs. He stopped for a moment, leaning against the wall, his injured shoulder screaming with every breath. He thought of the years he had spent trying to bury the soldier in him, the long, quiet mornings, fixing engines, the sound of laughter from a distant neighbor, and Max lying in the sun. Those memories now felt like fragments from someone else's life. A soft growl pulled him back. Max had stopped, his body stiff, tail straight. The dog's nose pointed ahead toward a faint sound, a metallic click, then the whisper of movement. Ryan's blood went cold. He dropped to one knee, flicked the flashlight off, and listened. Footsteps light, careful, too careful. There were others in the mine. He reached into his pack and pulled a small combat knife, his fingers steady despite the tremor in his chest. He waited, counting the rhythm of the approaching steps. When the first figure appeared around the corner, Ryan moved. The knife flashed once, a silent strike. The man dropped soundlessly, his rifle slipping from his grasp. Max lunged at the second attacker before he could react, the sound of struggle muffled by the dust and echoing wood. Ryan caught the rifle mid-fall, switching the safety off. He dragged the first body aside, pressing his back against the cold wall. He could see the dim glow of flashlights deeper in the tunnel. At least 3 more, maybe 4. The mercenaries were cautious, trained. They had followed the same map, but not the same purpose. Ryan whispered low to Max, "Stay quiet." The dog settled beside him, chest-heaving eyes locked on the moving lights. The silence broke with the crack of a gunshot ricocheting down the corridor. The flash blinded him for an instant. Dust exploded from the wall near his head. He fired back, controlled bursts, each shot answering the flash ahead. The confined space magnified every sound until the air itself seemed to shatter. The firefight lasted seconds, but felt like hours. Then silence again. Ryan's breathing was ragged, the smell of gunpowder thick in his nose. One of the beams supporting the tunnel splintered, with a low groan showering them with dust. He knew they could not stay here. He moved forward, checking each fallen figure. The last two were down, but one remained the leader. He could tell, by the way the orders had been shouted, the measured pace of the attack. Whoever led them was still alive. They entered a larger chamber where the roof rose high above, supported by massive wooden pillars. The old mining equipment lay scattered in heaps of rust and decay. Chains hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly in the draft. Ryan crouched behind a broken ore cart, signaling Max to stay low. The pain in his shoulder flared again, spreading down his arm. He pressed a hand against it, blood seeping warm through his sleeve. A sound came from the far side of the chamber, boots scraping stone. The leader stepped into the pale light, filtering from a crack in the ceiling. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face half hidden by the shadow of a helmet, but his movements were sure calm, a professional mercenary. The man's rifle was raised, scanning the dark corners. Ryan steadied his aim, but the pain made his vision blur. He squeezed the trigger once. The shot grazed the man's side, but it was enough to send him diving for cover. Gunfire erupted again, echoing like thunder. Max barked once, then charged, darting between the pillars. The dog's speed broke the leader's aim, forcing him to fire wide. The echo of bullets tore through the wooden beams, splintering the air. Ryan moved from cover, firing short bursts until the rifle clicked empty. The leader rose, trying to flank him, closing the distance fast. Ryan reached for his pistol, but his wounded arm faltered. In that heartbeat, Max leaped through the dust, a blur of muscle and fury. He slammed into the man's chest, knocking him backward. The rifle clattered away. Max's jaws clamped onto the man's arm, dragging him down. The mercenary shouted, his struggle echoing in the vast chamber. Ryan stumbled forward, pain lancing through his shoulder. He aimed his pistol with his good hand and fired once. The shot ended it clean, the sound fading into the hum of the tunnel. Ryan dropped to his knees beside Max. The dog's chest heaved, his fur streaked with dust, but his eyes were bright alert. The chamber smelled of blood and stone and cold air. He reached out, resting a hand on the dog's neck, his voice rough. "You saved me again, boy." Max pressed closer, his body warm, steady his tail, flicking once in quiet reassurance. Ryan looked around the chamber, the broken machinery, the empty silence that followed. The mine had turned from tomb to battlefield, and they had survived, but only just. The pain in his shoulder pulsed like fire. He tightened the bandage using a torn strip of his sleeve, then stood slowly. The satellite phone had to be somewhere deeper ahead, but for now, survival was enough. He looked down at Max, who sat watching him, calm as always. "You lead the way now." He managed a faint smile despite the ache in his chest. Max rose ears forward, nose testing the air, then began walking toward the next tunnel entrance. Ryan followed his silhouette framed by the dim light, the man and his dog, moving deeper into the earth, guided by trust and the fragile thread of purpose that still held them together. The dawn broke pale and clear over the ridges, the air dry and still carrying the faint scent of stone and iron. Light crept slowly down the canyon walls, touching the broken rails that led into the abandoned mine. Ryan Brooks limped along the tunnel, his shoulder wrapped in a rough bandage, his body aching from exhaustion, but his mind burning with focus. Max trotted ahead, his fur streaked with dust, his breath steady and calm. The echoes of their steps bounced off the old wooden beams like quiet reminders that they were still alive. They had been walking for what felt like hours, following the old rail line deeper into the mountain. The mine seemed endless, each turn revealing more rusted carts and fallen beams, until at last they reached a wider chamber lined with shelves of forgotten tools and thick layers of dust. Ryan stopped his flashlight, sweeping across the room until it landed on a small metal door set into the wall. Its paint was faded and a cracked sign above it read, "Maintenance." He approached slowly, Max close at his side. The hinges groaned as Ryan forced the door open. Behind it lay a cramped space filled with old generators, coils of cable, and an emergency locker marked with the faded emblem of a government contractor. He felt a pulse of hope stir inside him, the faint echo of Weber's words about the satellite phone. He crossed the room, knelt by the locker, and pulled the latch. It opened with a metallic snap. Inside was a sealed container labeled Field Communications. A thin layer of dust coated it, untouched for years. Ryan lifted it out and placed it on a nearby workbench. Max sat beside him, ears perked, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Ryan pried open the case. Inside lay the satellite phone, black heavy and built for field use, its battery light still faintly green. Beside it, a folded map and a small note written in the same precise hand he had seen before. The note said simply, "Trust no one except the truth." Ryan exhaled his hands, trembling slightly. He powered on the device, the small screen flickering to life. Its interface was simple, a secure channel already programmed and labeled B. Carter. He recognized the name immediately. Ben Carter, the journalist Weber had mentioned. A man whose writing had once exposed corruption in a defense contract scandal years ago. Ryan remembered reading about him back when he still wore the uniform. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the call button. The sound of the mercenary leader's final breath still lingered in his mind, along with the image of the fire that had swallowed his cabin. He had spent years trying to live quietly, and now here he was, once again, holding the fate of men and governments in his hands. He looked down at Max, who sat watching him, eyes warm and steady, as if saying, "You already know what to do." Ryan pressed the call button. The signal took several seconds before a voice came through, rough, deep, and cautious. "This is Carter." "Who is this?" Ryan cleared his throat, his voice low and steady. "Name is Ryan Brooks, former Marine. I have something you need to hear." There was silence on the line. Then the journalist spoke again, slower, more careful. "Go ahead." Ryan explained everything: the crash, the drive, the files, the proof of weapons smuggling through Aegis Tactical Solutions. The words poured out calm at first, then urgent, carrying the weight of nights spent running and bleeding for this truth. When he finished, there was a pause long enough for Ryan to wonder if the connection had died. Then Ben Carter spoke again. His voice changed. It held the sharp tone of a man whose instincts had just been set ablaze. "Where are you now?" Ryan told him about the mine, the coordinates, the proof he held, and the threats closing in. Carter said quietly, "Stay where you are. We have people who can verify the data. I will make the call to the federal field office. Do not move until you see them. And Ryan, one more thing. Thank you for not giving up." The line went silent. Ryan set the phone down on the bench, his hands still. He leaned back against the cold wall, the adrenaline slowly draining away. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe fully. Max rested his head against Ryan's knee, the steady warmth of his companion grounding him in the moment. He reached down and stroked the dog's fur, his voice a soft murmur. "We did it, boy. Maybe this time it will mean something." Minutes turned into an hour. The sound of distant rotors grew louder above the canyon, a steady rhythmic pulse that filled the air with trembling vibrations. Ryan stepped to the tunnel entrance, the sunlight breaking through the mist, painting the ground gold. At the far end of the valley, figures appeared in tactical uniforms, not mercenaries this time, but federal agents marked with clear insignia. Their movements were disciplined, but not threatening. Ryan raised his hand, slowly, showing the small black case. The lead agent, a tall woman with gray streaks in her dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, approached. She had the bearing of someone used to command, but with a trace of empathy that softened her presence. "Agent Sarah Donovan," she said, her tone calm and firm. "You must be Brooks." He nodded. "The evidence is inside this." Ryan handed her the case. She opened it, glancing briefly at the contents before signaling her team. "Secure it and get this man medical attention." Her gaze lingered on Ryan for a moment. "You did something few would have risked. The truth will not stay buried this time." He gave a faint smile, tired but sincere. "I only kept a promise." As they led him out of the tunnel, the world outside seemed brighter somehow. The helicopter waited in the clearing, its blades slicing the morning air. Ryan climbed aboard with Max beside him. The dog pressed against his leg as the ground began to fall away beneath them. Through the open door, he saw the mine shrinking below the scars of battle fading into distance. Days later, the news broke across every major network. Aegis Tactical Solutions exposed in massive weapons, smuggling operation CEO Isabella Reed arrested, along with multiple senior officers. Federal prosecutors confirmed evidence provided by an anonymous source linked to a fallen pilot named Captain Thomas Weber. The headlines called it the Whisper Canyon Revelation, and beneath them, a single image showed a folded American flag draped across a medal Weber had finally received. The Medal of Valor, awarded posthumously for integrity and service. Ryan watched the broadcast from a hospital bed. His shoulder bound his face, pale from blood loss. The window beside him glowed with late afternoon light. Max lay curled on the floor, snoring softly. Ryan smiled faintly at the sound. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet battle that had restored a piece of its honor. He reached down and brushed his hand against Max's fur, feeling the steady rhythm of breath that matched his own. For the first time in years, the ghosts in his head seemed quieter. He had carried out his duty, not as a soldier, but as a man who refused to let the truth die. The road ahead was uncertain, but the morning beyond the glass was bright and endless. The morning sun rose soft and golden over Cedar Hollow, its light spilling through the tall pines and warming the earth. The air was dry and calm, carrying the scent of sawdust and freshly cut timber. Ryan Brooks stood outside his new cabin, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. The cabin was smaller than the one that had burned months before, but it stood solid, its wooden beams smooth and sturdy, built by his own hands. He paused to stretch his shoulder. The wound that had once bled fire now felt like a dull ache, a quiet memory of survival. The doctors had told him to rest, but rest had never come easily for him. The rhythm of work, the sound of a hammer, the grain of the wood beneath his palms. These were the things that steadied his mind. More than any medicine could Max lay on the porch, his fur glinting in the sunlight, ears twitching lazily, though his eyes stayed alert. The dog was older now, a few gray hairs threading through the black along his muzzle, but he carried himself with the same quiet strength as always. When Ryan walked by, Max thumped his tail once on the wooden floor without lifting his head. The rebuilding had taken months. He had used the small government stipend from the case, along with help from a few neighbors in town. A carpenter named Joe Hanley had lent him tools and advice. Joe was a tall, weathered man in his 50s with a slow drawl and hands thick from decades of work. He rarely spoke unless something needed fixing. His wife, Linda, would bring food each week, a kind-hearted woman with silver streaks in her brown hair and the habit of humming as she walked up the trail. They reminded Ryan that decency could still be simple. As Ryan worked, he found that silence no longer felt like loneliness. The days had a rhythm. Mornings spent cutting wood, afternoons shaping beams, evenings watching the sun slip behind the ridge. Max never left his side, even when the hammering grew loud. The cabin was nearly finished now, its porch wide enough for 2 chairs and a view of the dusty road winding through the trees. One afternoon, as the sun reached its highest point, Ryan sat on the steps with a cup of coffee, his gaze wandering across the valley. He thought of Captain Weber and the letter found in the cave. He thought of Ben Carter, whose articles had set the country talking about truth and sacrifice, and he thought of Sarah Donovan, who had visited him at the hospital a week after the case closed. She had brought a folded report and a quiet smile telling him the investigation had ended the right way. Her words had been formal, but her eyes held a kind of respect that spoke louder than medals. Ryan had not spoken much during her visit. He had only asked one question: did they honor Weber? She nodded. They did. She had left after that with a firm handshake, leaving behind an unspoken understanding between 2 people who had seen too much. Now, as the wind rustled through the pines, he felt a rare calm settle over him. The nightmares that had haunted his sleep had begun to fade, replaced by dreams of ordinary things: the smell of sawdust, the bark of a dog, the feel of warm sunlight on his skin. Later that day, Joe stopped by, carrying a bundle of shingles. Ryan greeted him with a nod. "You came just in time," he said. Joe grinned beneath his gray beard. "Someone has to make sure you don't build that roof crooked." Ryan chuckled, the sound rusty from disuse. Together, they worked through the afternoon, the steady rhythm of hammers echoing across the hills. Linda arrived with lemonade and bread. For them, Max sat nearby, watching the 3 with half-closed eyes, his tail brushing the porch like a metronome. When the sun began to fall low, the light turned amber, spreading across the clearing. Ryan stood at the edge of the porch, his shirt damp with sweat and sawdust. He looked at the cabin, its rough walls glowing in the golden hue of dusk. He had rebuilt it from ruin board by board, and in doing so, had rebuilt a part of himself. He turned to Joe and Linda, who were packing up for the day. "Appreciate the help." Joe nodded. "You would have done it anyway," he said. "You just needed a push." As they left down the road, Ryan sat beside Max on the steps. The dog lifted his head, resting it on Ryan's knee. Ryan scratched behind his ears and smiled. "You remember the old place, don't you, boy?" Max let out a low sound, somewhere between a sigh and a growl. Ryan looked out over the valley, where the sky had begun to deepen into gold and rose. He felt the wind brush against his face, carrying the warmth of the season and something gentler, something like peace. He thought about the meaning of home, It was not the walls or the roof, but the moments shared within it, the steady presence of a friend, the comfort of work, the quiet knowing that he had done what was right. He looked down at Max, whose eyes reflected the fading light, and said softly, "We are still here. That is enough." The horizon turned to fire as the sun slipped lower. Each tree cast a long shadow across the earth. Ryan stood and walked toward the half-finished fence around the yard, hammer in hand. Max followed him, stopping once to sniff the air. The world had changed, and so had they, but the bond between them remained unbroken. By the time darkness began to gather, the cabin stood complete. A warm glow spilled from its windows onto the porch. Ryan sat in the chair he had built himself. Max stretched beside him, resting his head on his paws. The night was quiet, save for the sound of crickets and the slow rhythm of breathing shared between man and dog. Ryan looked up at the stars, faint and scattered across the vast sky. And for the first time in years, his heart felt light. He reached down and patted Max's head, his voice low and even. "Happiness doesn't fall from the sky, boy. It grows right here where we stand." As the stars deepened over the valley, the night wrapped Cedar Hollow in quiet grace. Ryan sat, still watching the cabin glow like a lantern against the dark hills. He thought about the path that had brought him here, from war to fear to truth, and finally to peace. He had faced storms that tore down everything he once was, yet from that ruin he had built something new, stronger, and more honest. His hands were rough, his heart steady, his faith renewed by simple things. A loyal dog, a home rebuilt, and a sky that promised another dawn. Max shifted beside him, letting out a soft sigh that melted into the night. The world outside was still uncertain, but Ryan had learned that courage was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to keep walking even when the road vanished ahead. He understood now that no life was too small to hold meaning, and no act of kindness ever went unseen. Every nail he had driven into the wood, every breath he had taken beside Max was proof that purpose grows quietly where love and perseverance meet. The light of faith glimmered in him, not as fire, but as warmth, a steady reminder that grace comes not in grand miracles, but in the hands that choose to build again. When we lift each other, when we forgive, when we stay loyal, even in silence, we become part of something greater, something divine. The same wind that once carried the echo of loss now carried a whisper of hope. Ryan closed his eyes and offered a simple prayer, not for himself, but for anyone still searching for their way home. May you find light in your darkness and courage in your quiet moments. May the Lord bless your path and fill it with peace and mercy. And if this story touched your heart, share it so others may feel the same light. Leave a comment, tell your story. Join our community of faith and compassion. Subscribe so that each tale of courage and love finds a home in more hearts. And as you go, may God's grace walk beside you always.